As Nina said, the sort of the occasion of this is the publication of this book with Princeton Architectural Press. I just want to tell you a few things, sort of, what went into the process of making this. I'm always tempted to call it a book. It's not really. It's a box. It's made of paper. It goes on a shelf. You can call it a book. It's fine. But also just observations that have made about and around specimens over the years. If you've seen me do talks before, you'll know that I try to do these with a single a conceptual arc from start to finish. This will be more like sort of a collection of things, much like the box itself, a collection of sort of amusing bits and pieces, which will hopefully add up to a satisfying experience. You can tell me afterwards. So, Nina mentioned the library in the office. This is most of it. And it was about a year ago, or a little more, that I was sitting in this room with Paul Wagner and Sarah McKay of Princeton Architectural Press about these various ideas that I had for books and how we would get them done and what we would start with. And we paused for a moment and sort of looked around us at these hundreds of books and thought that perhaps this would be a good place to start, is to do something with all of this stuff that's here. It seems a shame for it to be sort of cooped up in this one room. But surely there must be some way to get this out into the world, which is how this came about. And you'll find a stack of them over there. And it was a lot of fun to make this project. It was actually a surprising amount of work and some interesting challenges that I'll tell you about. As I was thinking about how to sort of introduce and sort of describe this project, I realized that I had actually already done that on the insert here. So I don't normally do this in a talk, but I'll actually read a bit of what I've written here. Type specimens are curious things. They are books full of words, but the content is largely, if not entirely, arbitrary. And not even knowing the language, and even knowing the language is not altogether necessary. The narrative in these books is not in the words, but in the letters. Their stories of time and place are told by curves and joins and angles, the cadence of black and white. Type is relentlessly present, like the accent in speech or the color of soil. It can't help but speak about its origin while it charms us with beautiful form. I've been collecting specimen books for about 25 years. My library now has about 300 of them, spanning from the early 19th century to the present and representing 20 countries. When a new one arrives, the office comes to a stop as we gather around to appreciate the work of past colleagues. There are the masterpieces, acknowledged or not, the near misses, and the really, seriously, who thought this was a good idea? Those are the best. Even straightforward or, quote, normal type can be surprisingly rich and distinctive, as evocative as any decorative and theatrical design. The spirit of time and place always comes through, making a backdrop for so much painstaking work. These old books are lessons in typography's power and eloquence, speaking to specialists and laity alike. From shelf after shelf of possibilities, we chose a dozen examples from 4 countries, the United States, Great Britain, France, and Germany. Also 2 bonus cards to round that out to a nice 50. That was very important. I tried to pick designs that were distinct to that place and a part of its history without careening into stereotypes. It was genuinely difficult to choose only a dozen examples from each place when the histories were so rich. There are many stories to be found and read here. I hope you enjoy. So that was sort of tied up nicely in a couple of paragraphs what this whole story was about. It was meant to be a kind of something that would entertain typophiles, but also be a kind of gateway for newcomers to sort of invite them in and learn more about this amazing stuff that we love and live with. And the process began once we had figured out sort of the structure of what we were doing. The process began with lots of hours and hours with the books and lots of crappy iPhone photos that I never thought I would show anybody. But I was going through the books and just snapping photos of things that might look like they could be candidates. And these were culled and sorted and cut down to finally we got 50 and then took real pictures. This one. Ooh. These are all of these are ones that did not make it into the book. I really easily made a second box of cards. There are just so many of these amazing things. It was physically painful to leave this one out of the set. I really wanted this one in. But once that set of 50 was selected, there was a kind of surprise sort of challenge after that, which was to figure out what exactly on the page to make a card of, because the proportion of the card was already fixed. I had to find content to fit that. I didn't want to do lots of sort of Photoshop work or slicing things together. So I wanted to be able to just take slices or crops out of these books and for them to look good. And I would look at the proportions of this card and find that that might work. It's a little small, looks a bit lost. That's not bad. That's going to crop really too tight. That's going to crop way too tight. Not doing that. Ah, there we go. That's the card. That's actually in the set. There was one really fantastic surprise sort of late in the process where we got the press sheet back from the printer, and we got this out of the tube, laid it on the table, and we all thought, oh my God, can we get posters, wallpaper or something out of this? Can you just tell them so they not cut this down? I will talk to them later about that. But I also want to take this opportunity to talk about the specimens themselves, because as Nina said, I've been collecting them for a long time. They're a very sort of central part of how I work and think about this craft. This here is the 1912, I believe it's an abbreviated specimen from Schelter and Giesecke in Germany. This is the first specimen I ever bought. I think it's back in 1992 or 93. So it's a fairly humble thing, and a collection of everything else, but always a bit special. And one thing that sort of occurred to me about these specimens is that they're not just sort of catalogs or sort of representations of what a company has to offer on sale. They are essentially advertisements that you agree to bring into your printing office and stand up on your shelf. And so with that in mind, a number of these specimens become more interesting. There are a few that seem to have the goal of not only sort of impressing their customers, but also intimidating their competition by being completely, massively huge. That is a perfectly normal-sized pen down there. I've been told that this is the largest specimen. The 1925 Stempel is the largest specimen ever produced by anybody anywhere. And I have yet to find anything that's larger than this. I have to actually store this book on its back because the weight of I don't know how many thousand pages this is actually tears the binding apart. The 1912 ATF is a close second. I remember David Burley telling me a story that producing this book nearly bankrupted the company because they just aimed it just a little too high or way too high when they were producing this book, but happily they managed to recover from that and keep going. There are some other specimens that seek to impress not by just this sheer mass and number of pages, but just the size of the sheet. There's this 1932 specimen from Deverny Peignot for their Garamond typeface. there's that pen again to give you an idea of how big this thing is, which is a little bit odd given that this is a text face, but okay, fine. We'll go with something that's like the size of a lectern Bible or something. But you know, it's a lovely thing to behold. I can't store it with any of the other books. It has to live on a shelf on the other side of the room, but that's okay. Many of these foundries had printing departments within them, and many of the founders would use that as another opportunity to sort of show off their skill and chops. And that would often show up in the title pages. The 1883 Nebbiolo specimen, often when anyone asks, like, what's my favorite book in the collection, I often grab this one because it's just so fantastic. The 1886 Shelter in Giesecke, there are about 6 or 7 of these pages introducing every section of the book. The Berling's foundry in Sweden, it's actually one of the lesser known foundries in Europe. They did fantastic work. Occasionally I think they would go a little bit overboard with this. This is a Bauer specimen from 1900. And what they're showing here is their, they call the, I'm not going to try the German. The two-color italic, they call it grotesque, doesn't really look like a grotesque. But of course they had to show off this two-color face by printing it in 6 colors. I can't really tell that's gold ink on that second line. This is just 5 of the 6 colors. One of the most kind of surprising moves comes in actually one of the oldest books in the collection. This is an 1828 specimen from the Boston Type Foundry, which, for what I can tell, is what might be its original binding, but does this rather startling move in the middle of the book. There's a vertical gatefold for a set of numbers. That's a badass. It's just downhill from there. This Shelter in Giesecke specimen about 1909 switches paper stock to show off their newspaper type, or what was their idea of newspaper type in turn of the century Germany. But this page actually started to come apart a bit because I suppose, after, 100 plus years, a sheet of newsprint is not really meant to last, but I did what I could with it. Once in a while, instead of the kind of theatrics and outright boasting that some of these foundries do, there are some moments of sort of humility. In this 1847 specimen from the Dickinson Type Foundry of Boston has this curious notice at the front. Notice, it is but truth to say that in the running of this specimen of printing type cuts, etc., through the press, no very particular care was taken with the press work. We had not the time to put any extra gloss upon the printing, and contented ourselves with letting it pass as a plain piece of work. We do not, therefore, enjoy the pleasure of seeing a very splendidly printed volume. But there is a satisfaction about the book, nevertheless, viz. It is as good as it looks to be. I don't know what that means, but, and then continues on to say, essentially, like, this is kind of okay, but you'll do so much better when you buy our type and print with it. It'll be great. The printing in this book, by the way, is great. I don't know what they're so worked up about. But there's actually a bit of confusion. If you pay close attention here, this is E and F Giles, type founders of London. Turn the page, we'll find F and E Giles, letter founders. A couple more pages, we're back to E and F. Now it's Kyle's, because I know they're just going too fast. They misspelled their own name. And then a little bit later, we're back to F and E, but now they're in Bristol, and they can't even agree on where they are. Never mind the name. We tried doing some research to figure out just exactly who F and E are, and the story behind this foundry is so sort of convoluted that we actually don't know who F is. There's the cat. I don't know. One thing that many of these books do not say is when they're printed. As you might imagine, producing these books was a serious endeavor, and the foundry would want to leverage that effort for as long as possible and keep this book in circulation as long as possible. And putting a date on it would just make it seem sort of obsolete. So many foundries would avoid putting a date on there and making it kind of a sort of piece of detective work to figure out when exactly the book was presented. One solution that Foundry tried for this kind of keeping a book current problem was the Inland Foundry of St. Louis. And from 1905 to 1909, they had this specimen, which had this, instead of a traditional binding, had this set of screw posts that customers were meant to take apart on a regular basis. They've showed you how. And every couple of months, you would get in the mail these, with instructions. Be sure to remove and destroy pages 31 and 32 now in your book, which this sheet will replace. Be sure to put this here, be sure to put that there, and in case you got confused about any of it, they sent you a list of where all these pages were meant to go and what they were meant to replace, but they did understand you might be too busy for this. And if you are too busy, just get someone else to do it. After 1909, they gave up on this and went back to regular books. One of the other kind of dimensions of these books and the sort of the policy of the foundry is how much of each typeface would be shown, particularly whether or not a full character set would be shown. Particularly into the 20th century, many American foundries were pretty chill about showing full character sets, as were Dutch and German and Italian foundries. The French and English were really quite shy about this. They almost never did it. This is the 1978 specimen from Rhode. This is actually the book that my revival of Nobel was made from, just a few pages back. There's microgramma in its original state. And there'll be some surprises if you look closely in something as mundane as a character set here, like the sort of local attitude of what exactly the alphabet is. You see the W comes after a Z here. Because as far as the Italians are concerned, that's a foreign letter. That goes down at the end with the C cedilla and the AE and OE and the rest of it. Another sort of dimension of this, which would show up mostly in European specimens, is the language of the text that would be used here. Nebbiolo was really quite good about rotating the text from English to German to French to Italian to Spanish and back again with every paragraph they showed there. Seemed like other foundries might remember to do that, might not, or would only do that for the editions that would go into other countries. And Americans, of course, would just never bother with that. There's another kind of sort of point of mechanics here, which is that we're talking about metal type here, which meant that every size was a separate item to be sold and bought and shipped and stored and all that, which meant that you had to show every one of these, which meant that you could very likely blow an entire page, or perhaps 2 pages, showing one style. And it's completely inconceivable in this business now to spend that much real estate showing a single style, or actually, if you are going into really, really big sizes, this is a Bruce series that goes into, this is what, 60, 84, and 120 point type, and I think the showing for this one style goes on for, I think, 5 or 6 pages. And for the most part, that sort of odd piece of sort of aspect of the making these books seems kind of awkward to us, but it's actually fine because most of these designs stood alone anyway. The idea of a family didn't come until much later. The exception to that would be in text faces, where you would, on a pretty regular basis, find Romans accompanied by their italics. And occasionally, Roman and italic pairs might climb out of text sizes and into something larger. 5 lines pike would be about 60 point. But that was definitely the exception. This, by the way, is the oldest specimen in the collection, Frye and Steele, 1814. One sort of aspect that of some of these books that hadn't occurred to me, that this combination of sort of showing one style with another was something that might be show up in some books, unless you're looking at a linotype specimen, in which case that is the very sort of central feature of the machine, and therefore it's the central feature of the specimen book. So you always see Romans with their italics, or some oddball combination of this Roman serif thing with this bold sans serif thing, and that's, that was the thing you could buy, and that's how the machine works. So that's how these were. That's how all of these were shown every time, with a few exceptions. Linotype would once in a while do one-letter versions of things. Another point about, for talking about text faces, occasionally, especially in sort of the older specimens, you'd find this piece of text repeated over and over again, called the Catiline orations. And apart from sort of being in Latin and sort of clarifying that this is text, you're not really meant to read, you're just supposed to sort of like look at it and get a sense of the taste of it. It's actually kind of a sneaky way to cheat, because Latin doesn't have characters like W and Y and J and other things that screw up potentially the rhythm of the text. It's all the sort of overwhelming majority of it are these really solid square and round forms. So if you set anything in Latin, it will automatically look better. And they just count it on their customers not knowing that. So everything looks great, it's fantastic. You can impress your friends with some other piece of information. The Americans were pretty, apart from the things of linotype, the Americans were pretty hands-off about suggesting how one of their typefaces might be used with some other of their typefaces. The Continentals, on the other hand, could not wait to show you all the great stuff that you could do when you start mixing this stuff together. Like this sort of hypothetical classified section from a newspaper as cooked up by Ludwig and Mayer, 1937. Or this fake timetable from Deverny and Pagnot, 1914. Or this fantastic piece of confectionery from the Mayer foundry around 1905. I was thinking of this point in the lecture as the part where Matteo Bologna faints. I say every lecture should have one of these. But they went through just combination after combination, so they were determined to show off every last thing you could make with everything they've got. Occasionally, something would go a bit wrong in the composition of the specimen, and would perhaps not be what the foundry had in mind to put these typefaces in their best light. There's probably no word other than this one that would do a better job of showing off how badly spaced this typeface is. The fact that it just cannot support itself with the way it's drawn, but oops, that's the way that went in. I had wondered a number of times, given the fact that these are blocks of lead stacked next to each other, and combinations like PA and AV and LT and so on would leave these big gaps of space unless there are special versions with notches cut into them to nest over each other. I wondered, I still wonder, if the compositors had sort of standing orders to avoid text that contains pairs like P8, AT, and so on and so on. And if you look through a lot of these specimens, you just won't see that combination. And I wondered if the sort of weird meandering quality of the text is in some part driven by the compositor avoiding certain sequences of letters, that sort of subbing in something else that just doesn't have an AV in it or whatever. But occasionally something will slip through. Something might not be noticed. Feel a bit bad for the people of Sweden, or Sweden. But occasionally, these mistakes could be really informative. This was a titling face that was very popular through the late 19th and the very beginning of the early 20th century. And something like 9 or 10 different foundries carried this and showed it in their specimens. And for the life of me, I could not figure out how the side bearings in this face worked. I couldn't figure out how they had manufactured this until I saw this. And the compositor had screwed up, and I realized that this was designed with the assumption that the compositor would manually space every one of these combinations. This could not be set out of the box. And it would mean that basically every character has 0 side bearings and the compositor figures it out, and that's how it looks good. I thought it kind of amazing that through all the specimens I'd looked through, no foundry ever mentioned this aspect of the design. That it's kind of like, this one is manual, it's not automatic. But I actually used the sort of the lesson from this in working out Surveyor, because it works on sort of similar kind of proportions. But there are other kinds of stories that these specimens can tell, I think perhaps inadvertently, just about sort of the time and place and the sort of environment they lived in. One of my favorite moments comes in the 1906 specimen from American Type Founders. It's a pretty substantial book, not one of these monsters, but still pretty big. And there's page after page of this very quaint, kind of gawky looking stuff that you would expect from America around the turn of the century. And I don't know what you would use this for, and then suddenly, bang! 20th century has begun. Like a pile of bricks. In case you missed it, here we are. Deal with it. Some of the other stories that we find in the books are actually less about the foundry and more about the customers using these books, because all of these books had previous owners who were, in the type or printing trade in some way or another, and were making decisions about Pica Gothic number 4. Yes. Great Primer Gothic number 3. Nah, don't bother. No. Once in a while, I'll find these sort of teasing notes about what exactly, very specifically, what's the customer was going to do with this particular thing. I don't know if this is going to be a timetable or a map or what. One of these specimens from Nebbiolo in Italy actually had a couple of order forms inside the front cover. And as I think not only as someone who buys type, but also someone who sells type, this is kind of a fascinating thing to consider. Certainly in moments when the website is acting up and somebody can't download their font, and so on. I like to think of this. There is a short and puzzling, entertaining episode in the type business where customers could place orders by telegraph, and telegraphs would be, or telegrams would be paid by the word, and as a service to their customers, many foundries, in this case Linotype, would come up with some kind of code that would be a unique identifier for specific design and a specific size. So the customer could just send a message, Soul Fair, or Soul Fake, Soup Man, to the foundry, and that would mean the 8.0 Remington typewriter, so on and so on. So it'd be nice to bring this back in some way. I don't know what it would be. Really nothing to do with buying or selling or using type, but just someone's thoughts on how the world ought to work, or someone thinks that this statement needs a bit of revision to be more inclusive. Okay, props to whoever owned this specimen somewhere in the last 118 years. Or someone who's, I don't know, just bored. I really like to think that someone was on some like candlestick phone on some really boring call, doodling this out. Yeah, yeah. As I was saying before, the text of these specimens could be whatever, just as long as it is sort of representative of the design. And some foundries took advantage of that to be a bit entertaining. This is Lawrence Johnson in Philadelphia, 1857. And for a number of, particularly for the ornamental designs, he would pick words that kind of riffed on the sort of the nature of this design. Thomas McKellar at McKellar Smith & Jordan, which is the firm that became the successor to Johnson, took this idea and ran with it and blew it up even bigger, not only making these texts that kind of danced with and played with the sort of behavior of the design at hand, boundaries with this outline thing, or letters that actually look like they're tumbling or lying down on mountain slopes. He took this a step further and started writing text for specimens that it was just this kind of stream of consciousness, this kind of, it was like a stand-up routine that went on for 100 pages and more. Some of it took the sort of written form of an advertisement for some business or some kind of public notice. Solomon Bigwig, retailer of gossip, counselor in matters of the most frivolous or momentous, author and publish of fictitious incidents. Monkey, Squirrel and Company, Tree Climbers and Nutcrackers, Forestdale. Newly invented knowledge injector, no worriment of brain. The entire circle of the sciences squirted delightfully into the cerebrum of the unconscious recipient. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0. Liemonger's Laboratory, made to order, state secrets, cabinet doings, private scandals. And after a while, some of these lean more towards a kind of headline, newspaper headline kind of cadence. Director's annual report, continued prosperity and increased dividend, bankruptcy speedily following. Well, actually, I hadn't found this one until the other day. Passengers' tribulations. Tunnel entrance. Passenger supposes there is plenty of time to change his shirt. Hair caught in button. Train emerges with shirt over his head. The Bruce Foundry in New York used this opportunity of the text of the specimens to do something way more serious. And they worked with the printing scholar Theodore Lau-Divini to turn every piece of specimen text into a history lesson, which is kind of useful in some cases, kind of tiresome in other cases. But you'll get some little tidbit about parchment was invented, how books printed on bad paper were handled in Paris in the 16th century. And did you know printers were authorized to carry swords? And even when the designs started to get kind of silly, Divini would not give up. He would just keep giving you bits of information. Here's this long bibliography of other people's writings on the history of printing. And even when, after, 1,490 different styles, and it was really time to chill, Divini kept going. I just want to tell you about the first Bible of Gutenberg. In the specimen that Divini made for his own press, he took this curious tack of making the text of the specimen a comment on that design, or telling about its features, but not only what he thinks of it, as well as what he thinks of it. And he was really not subtle about what he thought. He had some really great stuff in his collection there, some of which we thought was a bit puzzling, startling, but readable. And other things that Hughes really just did not like at all. Say sorry exhibit of compressed, tortured letters. How they suffer from squeezing. And by 1901, I don't know if Divini had retired or, but the long sort of relationship between him and the Bruce Foundry has ended. And when the Foundry put out its specimen, it was one of their last specimens in 1901, I guess they wanted to sort of keep it highbrow, or educated at least. And instead of all of this historical text from Divini, they got all of their text from Shakespeare and seemed to make a point of taking the bloodiest and most violent scenes out of Macbeth and Richard III and Julius Caesar, and just using that to set their text. Overboard, into the tumbling billows of the main. Oh Lord, methought what pain it was to drown. 1, 2, 3, 4. What dreadful noise of water in mine ears, the sights of ugly death within mine eyes. 1, 2, 3. I thought I saw 1,000 fearful wrecks. 1, 2. 1,000 men gnawed by fishes. 1, 2. I actually had the phrase "gnawed by fishes" up on my wall in the office for a long time. It was too fun. But this goes on for people being stabbed, people being killed, death, blood. Oh, pardon me, thou bleeding piece of earth, that I am meek and gentle with these butchers. Thou art the ruins of the noblest man that ever lived in the tide of times. Woe to the hand that shed this costly blood. Over thy wounds, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now do I prophesy which, like dumb mouths, do ope their ruby lips to beg the voice and utterance of my tongue. A curse shall light upon the limbs of men, domestic fury and fierce civil strife. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Just continues like that for dozens of pages. It's kind of I actually have to put it down after a while. But to sort of wrap this up, I wanted to sort of give you another sort of perspective on as what I've sort of learned from these specimens. And way back in 1994 and 95, I designed the first specimen book for Font Bureau in Boston. This is the second edition. The first edition is black on black, and it's completely impossible to photograph, so I showed you this one instead. And when I was thinking of how to structure these pages, or to come up with a format that could work with all the things in the library, I thought back to that first Shelter and Giesecke specimen from 1912. Remember these really sharply defined blocks of text, just really dense, almost architectural forms on the page, and it was just so compelling to look at, and it just sort of really concentrated the flavor of each design and sort of propelled it forward. And these waterfalls just look fantastic, but I worry that this and it might get a bit sort of tiring after a while. Might also not be so flexible for anything with more than one style in it. And then remembered these formats that I'd seen in some Italian and German specimens. This is essentially a scrambled waterfall where all of the sizes are there, but they're done out of order, either in some kind of interleaved sort of boustrophodontic sort of thing, or something more random. So the sort of the format of the Font Bureau specimen came down to a pretty simple formula, which is these scrambled waterfalls from these Italian specimens and the snarky McKellar style writing, And that's what these old specimens were made of. And I thought it kind of funny that this format that it seems to have become kind of popular among lots of foundries, that it gets repeated without really sort of understanding quite how it's supposed to work with the sort of the mixing of styles and sizes. And, you know, I guess you can do this without the sort of goofy, snarky writing, but yeah, I think that's part of the appeal. But in any case, like I said, this was, there isn't really a conclusion here because I've really come to present a box of hopefully amusing things. And I wanted to not only thank the TDC for hosting this and having me here, but absolutely Nina Stosinger and Fred Shallcrass, who did tremendous amounts of work to put this together, but also Paul Wagner and Sarah McKay at Princeton Architectural Press for publishing said box of great stuff. Thank you.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Yes, on some of these specimens, there's a measurement of weight off to the side, some numbers of pounds and ounces, and that was an indication of how much of this design you would get. Particularly for text spaces, if you're casting hundreds and hundreds of lowercase e's, there's really no point in counting them. It was much simpler to just run the caster, throw it on a scale, and say that you're going to get 5 pounds of lowercase e's or whatever it is. At one point here, I had a page from one of the specimens offering asterisks by the pound. It's a fantastic idea. But yeah, that was just a dimension of buying the type. Yes?
What's your organizational system for the specimens?
Oh, so the organizational system for mine?
Yeah.
In the library, they are arranged by country, and then alphabetically within that, with the exception of the U.S., which is divided between ATF and pre-ATF, just because. Yes?
You amassed all these type books. How useful are they in you developing new typefaces from those sources?
It was how useful are these books in developing new typefaces? They're fantastically useful because it not only in sort of suggesting specific forms, but also the strategies that put these together. Like that sort of inadvertent reveal of how the spacing works and that light caps titling face. There are lessons in here as well as sort of things to emulate or make variations of. So lots of lessons. Anybody else? Yes? Hi.
Hi. What was the decision behind making it a collection of postcards as opposed to a book?
What was behind the decision to make it a box of postcards rather than a book? I thought a collection of cards would just leave more options to sort of interact with this, so that if you were a type professional and wanted to sort of take this condensed slab serif and stick it up on a mood board, then it's already a card. You can just go ahead and do that. If you wanted to, I don't know, troll your parents who have no idea what your design job is, then you could send them a postcard, or anything in between. So it was about sort of accessibility and sort of making this and flexibility so that people of any level of familiarity would have some way of enjoying this. Yes, hi.
Okay. So since the time of designing those early font bureau specimens, have you had any new insights about things that you think are important in arranging type?
Yes, and I was tempted to follow the font bureau specimens with something about the specimens that we make at our now at the that Frere-Jones. Because ironically, that a sort of condition of how much space is sort of given over to show a single style is sort of ironically it's kind of come full circle, and it's not an issue again anymore because we're making PDFs and we can safely assume that people will download this and print, if they are going to print it at all, just print whichever parts of the PDF they find relevant. So we can actually take an entire page to show you what the book with its italic looks like at 8 point and 9 point and 10 point and so on. So there's a kind of there's a sort of freedom in that really wasn't there before, but we have a much more complicated thing to show with all the different dimensions of weight and size and all caps, mixed case, Romans with italics, Romans with bold, so on and so on. So this multi-dimensional thing they have to flatten somehow onto a series of pages. So there's, I don't know, if you get me and Nina and Fred together, we can talk for hours on that. I see Tim Ripper in the background there. If you can have some thoughts on that as well. Anyway. Yes, hi.
Hi. Do you collect current type specimens, and will people 100 years from now be collecting type specimens? And I don't know, will you be collecting the website, the web type specimens?
The question was, do I collect current type specimens, and 100 years from now, will people be collecting the type specimens of today? Right? Yes, I do collect current specimens. And I certainly hope that what we're making now is endures enough and has enough kind of appeal beyond this immediate time frame for people to hang on to them. What people would do with digital specimens is I have no really idea or suggestions about that. Really no clue. Don't ask me. But yeah, I would certainly hope so. Anybody else? No? Okay, well, thank you for coming.